friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica, and in today's video I am bringing you another episode of True Crime Sunday. Now if you're new here, of course this channel is primarily makeup focused, but I've always been very intrigued by true crime. So a while back I started doing monthly true crime videos centered around the state of Oregon, crimes from Oregon, because that is my home state. But as time has gone on, I thought it would be interesting to expand my horizons and bring you cases from all over the world. And I do these videos once every other month now. It's just a little bit too time consuming for me to do these once a month. Now this video is about the case of Gertrude Baniszewski. She brutally and horrifically murdered 16-year-old Sylvia Likens in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1965 with the help of her daughter, her son, and two other teenage boys. Now, I heard about this case several years ago when I watched a movie about it. I had never heard anything about it before then, and I haven't really heard anything about this case since I watched that movie. And I think the reason why is because it is such a horrific, grueling, violent, heartbreaking case. And honestly, I did think about not covering this case in a video here on my channel, but my goal in doing these true crime videos is to try to give a voice to the victims as respectfully as I possibly can. And I really believe that Sylvia Likens absolutely deserves to have a voice here and to have her story be told. Now, all the information I will be giving you in today's video came from this book right here. This is called Torture Mom by Ryan Green. I picked this up off of Amazon. And this really does read like a novel. And at first I thought, well, how does he know all this information? So I did do a little digging into the information that he's giving in this book and how he got it. And basically, all of the details, most of the details he's giving came from testimony in Gertrude Baniszewski's trial from multiple people, just kind of telling exactly what happened in this case. Now, I'm going to be giving you a lot of information in this video, but if you want even more, I highly recommend checking out this book. It is very well written. It's very hard to read, I will say, but based on all the other sources I looked into, it's very factual. And like I said, just, how do I say this is very well written? It's just, I really appreciated all the detail and the thought that he put into writing this book. And I will put the Amazon link to this book in my description box. Now, of course, as with all of my other true crime videos, I want to give a huge disclaimer here. Viewer discretion is absolutely advised. I will be detailing some awful, violent crimes here, heart-wrenching crimes. I would not have young viewers around while you're watching or listening to this video. And I also want to say that some of the verbiage that I will be using in today's video is not verbiage I would ever use in my day-to-day life. But because these crimes took place in 1965, I will be using verbiage that was used back then. So without any further ado, let's get into the case of Gertrude Baniszewski. Gertrude Nadine Van Fossen was born on September 19th, 1928 in Indianapolis, Indiana. She was the third of 6 children and was from Polish descent on her mother's side and Dutch descent on her father's side. Now, not a lot is known about Gertrude's early childhood other than the fact that she was a huge daddy's girl. Her father showered her with love and affection. And that caused her siblings to grow very jealous of her over time. And not only did they grow very jealous of her, but so did her own mother. Her mother did not like the fact that Gertrude and her father had such a close, loving relationship. And at first, she was kind of resentful of Gertrude. And then as time went on, she grew to just downright hate Gertrude. And when her father would be out of the house at work or running errands or what have you, Gertrude's mother was extremely verbally abusive to her. And as time went on, she became very physically abusive to her as well. Gertrude was also not a very good student. And because her mother didn't care one way or the other about her, her mom never really pushed her to go to school. So her school attendance was spotty at best. Gertrude's father had a pretty serious drinking problem, and this caused him to be in and out of work quite often. And Gertrude's mother would blame her for her father's problems and shortcomings. So it was a very contemptuous, ugly relationship between Gertrude and her mother her entire life. Now, when Gertrude was 10 years old, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her father, and he was helping her with her reading homework when all of a sudden he reared back, fell to the ground, but as he was falling, he smacked his head on the kitchen table and then just fell in a heap, bleeding heap on the kitchen floor. Now, Gertrude's mother came running in and checked his pulse, and he was dead on the floor in the kitchen. Now, her father is gone, so there's no one to continue to protect her from her mother. And her mother, of course, blames Gertrude for the death of her husband. So the abuse just amped up and amped up. Gertrude was not safe from abuse in her home at all anymore now that her father was gone. Now, at age 14, Gertrude went off to high school, and at this point was going through puberty and was starting to be noticed by the boys around her. They found her very attractive. And because she was so love and attention starved now that her father was gone, she really glommed on to the young boys at school and began to use her sexuality as a form of power and also as a way to get attention from boys. So she started becoming pretty promiscuous around age 14, 15 years old. Now, of course, her reputation was known by others at the school and in the community. And of course, her mother found out about her promiscuous reputation and of course would accuse her of being evil and unholy and unwholesome, and basically forced her other children to just completely shun Gertrude because she would say she was terrified that Gertrude's evil would spread onto her siblings. And because she was promiscuous and sleeping around with a lot of boys, a lot of the girls at school didn't like her either. So she lived a very lonely, very isolated existence throughout her teenage years. Now, at age 16, she'd fallen in love with 18-year-old John Baniszewski and just could not handle her living environment at home anymore. So she packed up her meager belongings and left home to go and marry John Baniszewski, and they moved into a small home together. Now, John was working as a police deputy at the local police station, very successful there. And so initially when they got married and settled into a home together, their lives were pretty good. But as time went on, Gertrude started to despise having any kind of sexual relations with John. She was very tidy in the home. She expected the home to be very clean. And she also expected to keep very tight control over their finances. And anytime John would want to go out and blow off some steam with his friends, he had to really plead and beg Gert to allow him to have money to do that. And so he got very resentful and very angry at Gertrude because she just was not the woman that he married. And slowly over time, started to verbally abuse her, which then turned to physical abuse, which then turned to sexual abuse. He sexually abused her, raped her on multiple occasions. And over the course of 10 years, she gave birth to 4 of his children. And because she had grown up in such a horrific, loveless family situation, she showered her children with love. She wanted her children to feel all the love and the support and the care that she never received when she was growing up. Well, John didn't like that either. He became very jealous of his own children because he wanted to be the most important person in Gertrude's life. And John's physical abuse of Gertrude just went on and got worse and worse. And because he was a police deputy, she didn't feel safe to go and report this to the police department because she knew no one would believe her. But eventually she finally had enough of this horrendous abuse and got the power and the strength to get out of the marriage and divorce him. And he was totally fine with that because he didn't want to be married to her anymore anyway, and really didn't want to have anything to do with raising his children either. Now, a few months later, Gertrude married her second husband, Edward Guthrie. Now, when they got married, he was unemployed and a pretty heavy drinker, and basically just married Gertrude because she was receiving such great child support checks from John. And after they had been living together for a while as a married couple, he also grew extremely jealous of Gertrude's relationship with her children, and he too started to physically abuse Gertrude horribly. Now, they were married for a few years until Edward finally sobered up and got a job. And once he started making his own money, he didn't need Gertrude anymore. So he left her and the children high and dry. Now, not long after she divorced Edward, she and John Baniszewski ran into each other somewhere out in public, and sparks flew. They started dating again and actually got remarried. And they were married for 7 more years before they got divorced again. 10. Now, during that 7-year time period, Gertrude was pregnant several times, but had multiple miscarriages, kind of one after the other, and fell into a horrible depression. She wasn't taking care of herself. She wasn't taking care of the house. It grew to be a complete disaster. And she really wasn't taking very good care of her own children either. And John, of course, got very resentful and very angry, and the physical and verbal abuse started right back up again. Now, she did give birth to 2 healthy children, so now she had 6 children by the time she and John ended their marriage for the second time. And pretty much right away, she began an affair with a man by the name of Dennis Wright. Now, he was 10 years younger than her and was married at the time of the affair. And his wife found out about it and, of course, in a rage, left him. And then Gertrude and all 6 of her children just moved right into Dennis's house with him after his wife left. And initially, things seemed to go pretty well. Of course, he was obsessed with her sexually, very attracted to her. That's really what kind of obviously started the affair to begin with. But Dennis did not want to have any children. And now here are 6 children that are not his living under his roof. And Gertrude just let them do whatever they wanted to do. And his house grew to be a chaotic mess from hell. And he just couldn't take it anymore. But he was still so obsessed with her physically that he just was allowing this to go on under his roof. Now, at one point, she did become pregnant with his child. And he was so angry that he violently beat her until she miscarried. And not long after she miscarried, she did get pregnant again. And at this point, she begged him to be able to have the child, which he very reluctantly agreed to. So she did carry the baby to term, had the baby. And the day that she came home from the hospital, she walks in the house and Dennis has left her, taken his belongings and just left her the house, but left her and the children never to be heard from again. Now, of course, Gertrude's reputation was very important to her in their community. So she told anyone that would listen to her that he had married her, that they were actually a married couple before he up and left her, because she did not want people to think she had a bastard child. Now, this is when the Baniszewski household became extremely dysfunctional and honestly rather scary. Because like I mentioned, Gert was letting the kids do whatever they wanted to do. And of course, kids age. And in 1965, the oldest, Paula Baniszewski, was now 17 years old. She was kind of like the ringleader of all the kids. There was 15-year-old Stephanie, 12-year-old John, 11-year-old Marie, 10-year-old Shirley, 8-year-old James, and 1-year-old Dennis Jr. Now, Gert was allowing all of them basically to bring over any friends that they wanted to have over, nighttime, daytime, weekend days, school days, didn't matter. And basically just letting them party. They could listen to loud music, they could smoke, they could eat whatever food they wanted. I mean, it was an absolute disaster in that house. But of course, because that's fun, the kids were all always going over to their house and hanging out. And the other parents in the neighborhood, in the community, were kind of like fine with it almost, because they didn't want their teenagers underfoot. They wanted their teenagers out of the house. And also they knew that Gertrude was present, so they weren't adultless at these gatherings. And Gert's real main goal was to become everybody's friend. Like, she wanted to be considered their peer. All the kids would call her mom. They thought she was wonderful. And this just became their normal way of living, to have all the kids at the house, to party. And Gert was kind of like the overseer of all this activity. Now, in July of 1965 is when Sylvia and her sister Jenny Likens joined the group that was gathering at the Baniszewski household. Now, Sylvia at this point was 16 years old and her sister was 14. And they lived with their parents, Lester and Betty Likens, in Indianapolis as well. Not far away, I don't think, from the Baniszewski household. Now, the Likens, very strange couple, they were super into working for traveling carnivals. That was just kind of their shtick. That's what they really enjoyed doing. But they did have several children, and it was really hard for them to take these jobs and have all these children in tow. So they were pretty neglectful parents from the very beginning. Sylvia and Jenny had 2 older siblings. Jenny was a fraternal twin, and I believe there was a couple other siblings that were younger than she as well. And Jenny, the younger of the 2, She was stricken with polio when she was a little girl and had a severe limp and wore a really painful metal brace on her right leg. Both Sylvia and Jenny were very pretty young girls, and Sylvia was just the light of everyone's life that knew her. She was very smiley, very happy, very energetic, had a great laugh. She was very dependable, very reliable. She was really close with her aunts and her grandmother, and she would commonly babysit for several children in the neighborhood, and she also had a lot of ironing jobs for other neighbors as well. Now, how Sylvia and Jenny came to be a part of the Baniszewski clan was on July 2nd, 1965. Their mother, Betty, got into a pretty horrendous fight with their father, Lester. And after he'd fallen asleep, she went into Sylvia and Jenny's bedrooms, had them gather up their clothes, they hop in the car, and they take off. Now, they didn't have a whole lot of money. And by the following, mid-afternoon, their money was gone, and the girls were starving. So their mother's like, I'm gonna go into the grocery store, I'll shoplift some food for you guys so we can have something to eat. Well, the police caught her and arrested her and took her down to jail. So here are Sylvia and Jenny starving in a completely different neighborhood, walking the streets looking for someone to help them. And here comes Paula, age 17, and Stephanie, age 15, Baniszewski. Now, they love to do this. They love to grab stray kids that were in the neighborhood and kind of bring them into the fold and take care of them. So this was perfect for them. They're like, hey, what's going on with you guys? Who are you guys? What's happening? And of course, Sylvia and Jenny, in tears, told them what was happening. And they're like, oh, well, just come back to our house. Our mom will let you stay here, no problem. So they were a little skeptical, but thinking, oh, this might be perfect because where else are they supposed to go? So they follow Paula and Stephanie back to the Baniszewski house and meet Gertrude, mom, and thought, wow, this is incredible. There's all these kids here. There's all this food, junk food. People are smoking, drinking soda, listening to music. This is perfect. So Gert said, yeah, that's fine. You guys can live here or stay here as long as you need to. Go ahead, pull up a bunch of dirty clothes, make a bed out of it. There you have it. So that's basically what happened. They just started staying there. Now, their mother did get released from jail, and Lester ended up finding out where they were. So within a couple of days, Lester and Betty come to the Baniszewski house to pick up Sylvia and Jenny. But of course, they've grown to be fast friends with Paula and Stephanie, and they don't want to leave. But Lester also had some news that he had just procured, he and Betty, a job at in the traveling carnival, and that they needed to get on the road. So they come up with this grand plan that the girls can stay with Gert, and she can help take care of them and keep an eye on them and stuff, and also, continue on with their wonderful new formed friendship with Paula and Stephanie and the other kids. And Lester will pay Gert $20 a week for this living arrangement. Now, Gert was not one to turn down money. She loved money. So she's like, oh, yeah, that's perfect. You send me $20 a week. They can live here, no problem at all. So, of course, everybody agrees to this living situation. And so Sylvia and Jenny are thrilled because they're tired of traveling with their parents or having their parents be gone on the road. And so, yeah, everything was going to be great, right? Well, that lasted for about 2 weeks. And then things started to get very bizarre and very frightening and very awful in the Baniszewski house for Sylvia and Jenny Likens. For whatever reason, Gertrude became very jealous of both girls, but especially of Sylvia, because Sylvia kind of started to hold court amongst the teenagers. This beautiful young girl, this new beautiful young girl that's hanging out at this house. And, the boys that were there were several teenage boys hanging out there, thought she was very attractive and were kind of hanging on every word. And Gert was seeing that and not really liking that because that's the role that Paula had in the teen friend group before Sylvia showed up. And also, Paula was very much like her mother at this age and was pretty promiscuous. Very sexually active with several of the young boys that were coming over and hanging out at the house, and she got pregnant. Now, everybody knew that she was pregnant, but it wasn't ever really talked about. And of course, Gert was terrified that people in the community would find out that Paula was pregnant and that she would gain this horrendous reputation that would rub off on Gert. So Gert just had this horrendous jealousy and resentment and seething hatred towards Sylvia because of all of this. Now, like I mentioned, for 2 weeks it was great, and then suddenly the abuse began. And basically how it started was one day they came home from school, and apparently they had school there in the summertime, which kind of shocked me because where I'm from, we start school in September, but this was in the mid-60s, so I'm not sure exactly how things went then. Anyway, they came home from school one day, and Gert just snapped. She had Paula and Stephanie help her grab Sylvia and Jenny, bring them into the bedroom, strip them from the waist down, and started beating both of them with a kitchen stir stick. Now remember, Jenny has polio, and she's wearing a very painful metal brace on her right leg, and Gert showed neither of them any mercy, beat them viciously on their backsides and down both of their legs. And I mean, Jenny was just writhing in pain, and of course so was Sylvia. And they have absolutely no idea why they're being beaten. And they said, what's going on here? Why are you doing this to us? And Gert says, well, you guys have been staying here for 2 weeks and your father has yet to send me any money. And this is what's going to happen to you every day until I get that check from your father for the $20. Well, actually, by that point, he owed her $40. Now, basically, he had sent the check, but the Postal Service was running behind. So it didn't take long for that check to show up. But between that first beating and the time the check showed up, they were beaten several more times. Now, both girls realized very quickly that the way to not be abused, to not be beaten by Gert, was to appeal to her vanity, her vain side. So Jenny hopped right on board with that. And of course, because she had polio and was in the brace, she really could not tolerate any kind of abuse to that leg anymore. So she went out of her way to basically kiss Gert's ass so that she would not continue to be beaten. Now, Sylvia was a very strong, very confident young woman, and she did not want to allow Gertrude Baniszewski to have any kind of power in her life whatsoever. Although she did acquiesce and kind of kowtow to Gertrude, Gert could really see this like spark of defiance in Sylvia, and her whole goal was to beat that out of her at every opportunity. And another way that Gertrude really maintained control over Sylvia and Jenny's lives was to starve them, really restrict their food intake. And that's really what other people started to notice as they were staying with the Baniszewskis, is that Sylvia and Jenny were just kind of wasting away to nothing. And not long after Sylvia and Jenny were staying with the Baniszewskis, Lester and Betty came for a visit. Now, Gertrude panicked because she did not want them coming into the house because, of course, it was a filthy mess. And there were some signs, even at this point, even this early on, that the girls were being abused. And, of course, she didn't want them to see that. So she made Sylvia and Jenny meet them down at a park. Now, of course, Lester and Betty immediately saw that the girls had lost a lot of weight and started questioning Gertrude, like, what's going on? Why are they so skinny? They look emaciated. And Gert's excuse was, well, the girls are really into this fad diet. You know, all the girls are doing that these days. And, you know, I'm really encouraging them to eat more. But, you know, what am I supposed to do? And they look perfectly healthy, don't you think? And so Betty's like, yeah, I guess so. And just took Gertrude's word for it. And, of course, Sylvia and Jenny are terrified of Gertrude. So the truth just never came out. And at one point during one of the Sunday school sessions, the reverend of their local church they were going to noticed how absolutely emaciated Sylvia had gotten. And so he gave her some food and some candy. Well, Paula and Stephanie saw that she was eating the food that the reverend had given her and immediately went home and told Gertrude that this is what was happening. And when Sylvia got home from church, it was just horrendous. Gertrude grabbed her and forced her into a kitchen chair and had, of course, Paula and Stephanie help keep her in the chair. She took a hot dog bun, grabbed a hot dog out of this jar, slapped it into the bun, filled it with mustard and ketchup, and started to cram this down Sylvia's throat. Cram it over and over and over down Sylvia's throat. And of course, it engaged her gag reflex, and she vomited all of this nastiness out onto the kitchen floor. And during this whole time, Gertrude's calling her a whore and a prostitute and a slut and just all these horrific, awful names, and grabs Sylvia and throws her down into the vomit on the kitchen floor and forces her to eat every single speck of her own vomit. And Sylvia did it. She had no other choice. She did this. And when she got up off the floor, Gert was then like rubbing her back and telling her what a good job she did and that she's so proud of her. And Sylvia had this like need to feel that affection and just kind of like almost leaned into that affection because she was so starved for it. So she'd just been horribly abused and is now accepting praise and comfort from her abuser. And something that was very confusing to Sylvia and Jenny, but especially Sylvia, because of course she was now receiving the brunt of the physical and verbal abuse, was that there were times when Gertrude was kind to her and would kind of let her hold court with all of the kids. And at one point, several weeks after she'd been staying there, one of those evenings had come around where Sylvia was sitting out in the living room with all the kids and kind of being the center of attention and laughing and joking around, and nobody was doing anything to stop it. Anyway, Sylvia started talking about boys that she had dated previously before obviously moving in with Gertrude Baniszewski, and was talking about the fact that, they'd kissed and held hands, and there's these, teenage boys, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys just kind of hanging on every word that she's saying. Now, Gertrude, of course, is sitting in the living room listening to all of this. And she becomes so enraged. She is just fuming that Sylvia is bragging about the guys that she used to date, that she stands up and starts screaming, "You whore, you're a prostitute, you slut. How dare you sit here and brag about all the men that you've been with, you whore." And she walks over to Sylvia, grabs her, throws her down onto her back, enlists several of the other teenagers to hold Sylvia in place, spreads her legs, and then starts stomping on her pubic bone over and over and over again. This went on for a long time, to the point where Sylvia was so hurt and in so much pain and so bruised and swollen and battered that she could barely walk after Gertrude was finished. And honestly, that area never really healed, and she never ever could sit down in a chair without some form of pain from that point on. Now, this is when Gertrude, Paula, and Stephanie started to spread around the school, around the community, around the church, that Sylvia was a prostitute, that she was sleeping with men for money. Now, at this time, Stephanie had a 15-year-old boyfriend by the name of Coy Hubbard, and Gert spread a rumor around the teenagers that Sylvia was sleeping with Coy. Now, Stephanie hears this and is just furious, gets right in Sylvia's face one day after school and starts smacking the crap out of her. And then all of a sudden hears Coy right in her face saying, "How dare you tell people that we're sleeping together? I wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole." Now, Gertrude again is witnessing all this and starts to tell Coy, like, "What are you doing? What kind of man are you that you're going to allow her to talk about you like this? I want you to beat the shit out of her. I want you to take her down in the basement and beat her senseless." And that's exactly what he does. Now, he is practicing judo, like he's learning judo. So he basically uses Sylvia as a sparring partner, takes her down the basement steps, and for hours beats her and beats her, throws her into the wall, throws her into the floor, until he's like breathless and covered in sweat. And this becomes a regular activity for Coy Hubbard, is to come over to the Baniszewski house, grab Sylvia, take her down in the basement, and just beat her mercilessly. Now, at this point, Sylvia is still attending school. She's still attending church. And people are seeing that she's coming to school battered, can barely sit down. She's coming to church in the same way, and nobody is doing anything about this. Even at one point, her older sister Diana, who lives not far away, just newly married, I think she had just had a baby, also is hearing the rumors that Sylvia is being beaten by this kid Coy down in the basement, and actually meets Sylvia and Jenny at the park to kind of like assess what's going on. And of course, they start to tell their older sister what's happening. And Diana's like, "There's no way this is going on. I don't believe you guys. There's no way that anyone would act this way." Now, fall is coming and it's starting to get cold outside. And the requirement at the school is that all the kids have a sweatsuit that they wear outside for PE. And of course, Sylvia doesn't have that because Gert's not giving her any type of anything. She's wearing like hand-me-downs and the same thing over and over again every single day. But she knows if she does not have this sweatsuit, that they're going to call home and tell Gertrude, like, Sylvia doesn't have a sweatsuit and now she's in trouble for not having one. And she knows damn good and well if she goes to Gert and asks her to get a sweatsuit, there's no way Gert's going to spring for that for her. So Sylvia sneaks into the girls' locker room and she steals another kid's sweatsuit. And she goes out onto the field and nobody says anything to her. And she thinks, oh, thank God I've gotten away with it. But no, she didn't get away with it. One of the kids, either Paula or Stephanie or who knows, sees her in the sweatsuit, knows damn good and well she stole it, and goes back and tells Gertrude that Sylvia has stolen this sweatsuit. And as soon as Sylvia gets home, she just lights into her. She grabs Sylvia, drags her into the kitchen, calls her a thief and a whore and a liar, and basically takes a lit cigarette that's never out of Gertrude's mouth. She was constantly smoking, and starts to burn all of Sylvia's fingertips, like almost down to the bone, and burns the backs and fronts of, or the palm side and the backs of both hands. And I don't know if you've ever been burned by a cigarette before, a burn of any kind. It is so horribly painful. And Sylvia was just a wreck. Her pelvis, her pubic bone is completely destroyed. And now her hands are totally burned to a crisp. And she's just thinking, I can't even imagine what was going through her mind at that point. And another way that Gertrude really loved to punish Sylvia was through humiliation. And the more humiliating she could abuse her, the better for her. And at one point, Sylvia, completely emaciated, covered in head to toe with bruises and burns and cuts and scrapes and all kinds of manner of injury. She was sitting in the living room with several of the teenagers, just kind of wilting away, kind of folded into herself. And Gertrude sees her and thinks, aha, I'm going to totally humiliate her in a way that I've never done before in front of all of these kids. So she has Sylvia stand up and she has her remove her clothing. She hands her a Coca-Cola bottle and tells her that she has to insert it into her own vagina or she's going to beat her senseless. And at this point, Sylvia has had all dignity stripped away from her, all sense of control stripped away from her, and knows that if she doesn't go along with what Gert is telling her to do, that the punishment will be so severe that she may not make it out alive. So indeed, she takes the Coca-Cola bottle and inserts it inside of her own body. Now, at some point, it gets stuck. This is really hard to talk about. And Gertrude comes over and forces the cola bottle up inside Sylvia completely. Now, something goes horribly wrong here, and she starts to bleed profusely. And they cannot get the cola bottle out. Eventually, they do somehow, and she's just laying in a heap, bleeding profusely from her vagina. Just awful. And Gertrude can't bear the sight of her, so she makes a couple of the boys, her own son, John, who's, I believe, 12 at this time, Coy Hubbard, pick her up and take her down in the basement and leave her. Now, she never heals completely from this injury, ever. And at this point, also, she loses complete control of her bladder and just can't hold her bladder anymore. So she's constantly, continually wetting herself. And that becomes another source of abuse for Gertrude, because what a filthy, diseased animal she is, that she can't hold her own bladder. So that becomes another way of, or form of abuse, that she makes fun of her for not being able to hold her bladder. She's incontinent now. And this was Sylvia's new existence. She was kept down in the basement and was beaten and starved day after day after day. And Gertrude could still see this like spark of defiance, she said, in Sylvia's eyes, and she just couldn't stand it. So she decided to like up the ante once again. She had several of the teenagers hold Sylvia down, and she took a knife, I believe, some kind of blade, and carved, "I am a prostitute and proud of it," into Sylvia's emaciated, bruised, battered stomach area, into her flesh. Also around that same time, Paula Baniszewski had broken her wrist and was wearing a cast. And Gertrude allowed Paula to beat Sylvia profusely with her cast. And then not long after that, Paula and a couple of the other kids carried Sylvia upstairs, stripped her clothes off of her, and threw her into a scalding hot bath where she ended up getting 2nd and 3rd degree burns. And then they all took turns scrubbing her burned flesh with salt, and then would just take her and toss her back down in the basement. There was just no end to Gert's ideas and plans for the abuse of Sylvia Likens. And eventually, at one point, she forced Jenny Likens to hit her own sister, which was just grueling for Jenny. And I cannot imagine either what it was like to be Jenny, watching her sister go through all of this horrific, awful abuse. And there was another major player here that was involved in the abuse and the ultimate death of Sylvia Likens, and his name was Ricky Hobbs. He was a newcomer to the group, 14 years old, and Gert was starting to realize that at some point Sylvia was going to die. I mean, that was her whole goal, was to kill Sylvia, and that she was going to need help removing her body and dumping her somewhere. So she started to have a sexual affair with 14-year-old Ricky Hobbs in hopes that he would help out. And also Ricky was kind of having like second thoughts about some of the abuse that she was goading him into, and started to like say, hey, I don't think we should be doing this, like questioning Gert. And she also felt that the sexual affair would stop the questioning, which ultimately it did. Now, on October 24th of 1965, this horrendous abuse of Sylvia Likens had been going on for over 3 months. And Gertrude could tell that Sylvia was wasting away to the point that her body was starting to shut down. She could see it happening. And she knew she had to have some kind of plan, because Sylvia's body was going to get discovered. So she hauls Sylvia upstairs, has her sit at the kitchen table, and basically write this letter saying that she had fallen in with this local boy group that were extremely sexually violent, that they had raped her repeatedly and beaten her repeatedly. And because of that, and also her being a prostitute, that she couldn't take living in this community anymore, so she was going to run away. Basically, Gertrude dictated this whole letter to Sylvia, and she was barely able to write, but she did do it. And that night, when she put Sylvia back down in the basement, Jenny went down and laid next to her, unbeknownst to anybody. She like snuck down into the basement, and Sylvia looked her right in the eye and said, I'm going to die. I know I'm dying. And Jenny's like, no, you're not going to die. And Sylvia said, yes, I am. I can tell that my body is shutting down. I am going to die. And on the following day, the 25th of October, Gertrude took some crackers downstairs to Sylvia, and she couldn't even eat the crackers. Her body was so emaciated and so shut down and so beaten and battered and just awful that she could not even swallow a simple cracker. And Gert snapped and had Coy Hubbard bring down a curtain rod, to which they both tried to shove the crackers down Sylvia's throat with this curtain rod. Then Coy took the curtain rod and just beat Sylvia over and over and over again. This went on for hours until she was laying on the floor unconscious. Now, in the wee hours of October 26th in the morning, it was reported that neighbors could hear Sylvia Likens howling and screaming and banging on something, asking for help. And nobody did anything to get her out of that basement. And at some point during the day on the 26th is when Sylvia Likens finally succumbed to her injuries and she passed away. When Gert discovered that she had passed away, initially what they did was, I believe they bathed her and dressed her, hoping that she would come to, but of course she didn't. And then they just basically put her back down in the basement. And Gertrude was just in an absolute panic. She's like, okay, I got to come up with something. I've got this letter. We got to get, So she has Coy and John, her own son, 12-year-old son, run down to the local payphone and call the police. And when the police arrive, Gertrude just instantly hands them the letter that she had Sylvia write. She's like, I don't know what's going on here. She's saying that she got involved with this abusive boy group, and she was going to run away because she's a prostitute, but she's dead down in the basement. We have no idea what happened. And they're like, what? So they go down into the basement, and can you imagine the scene they came upon? I mean, there's just all this filth and signs of horrendous abuse down in this basement. And the police are thinking, what in the hell has been going on here? Now, as the police are investigating the scene, Jenny Likens comes up to one of the officers and pulls him aside and says quietly, if you can get me out of here to a safe place, I'm going to tell you everything that's been going on in this house and exactly why my sister is lying here dead. And thank goodness the police officer agrees to do that. They take Jenny somewhere safe, and she immediately starts to tell them everything that's gone on since the time Sylvia and Jenny moved into the Baniszewski house. All the abuse, all of the humiliation, all of the torture, just everything. And the police are just aghast at what they're hearing. They cannot believe that this is what's been going on. But the crazy thing is that so many people had heard rumors that this is exactly what was going on. And eventually Diana, their older sister, did call the police and did call social services when Sylvia stopped going to school and Sylvia stopped going to church, and nobody did a damn thing to find out if this was what was really going on. So the police go back to the house and they immediately arrest Gertrude Baniszewski. They arrest Paula Baniszewski, Coy Hubbard, John Baniszewski, and Ricky Hobbs, and take them down to the police station, juvenile detention, respectfully. Now, at first, of course, Gertrude was the victim and Sylvia had brought all this on herself. That was the story that she was giving. But when the trial started in April of 1966, that story got flipped around on her very quickly. Now, one of the main witnesses that really blew this whole case apart was Gertrude's own 11-year-old daughter, Marie. Now, initially, Gertrude, of course, had coached all the kids to say the same story, that Sylvia had attacked Gertrude, that Sylvia was a prostitute, that all the beatings that Sylvia got were in self-defense or to try to beat the prostitution out of her. And on the stand, Marie just folded because her conscience finally got the better of her. And sitting there sobbing, she just let it all out and said exactly what had been going on. And her story matched exactly to Jenny Likens. Jenny Likens was another incredible key witness in the prosecution of Gertrude Baniszewski, Paula, John, Coy, and Ricky. And through the trial, all of them were found guilty. Now, let me start with Gertrude. She was found guilty of first-degree murder. And the hope of the community was that she would receive the death penalty, but she received life in prison. Now, eventually, she appealed and was able to get a second trial and was released from prison in 1985. She went to live with Paula, her daughter, who I'll get to here in just a minute. She changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen, which was her middle name and maiden name, and passed away in 1990 from lung cancer. Now, Paula Baniszewski was found guilty of second-degree murder and served 3 years in prison. And in 2012, she was working in Iowa as a teacher's aide in either an elementary school or a middle school. And somebody found out who she really was because she was going by Paula, different last name. Someone found out who she really was and leaked on Facebook that she was Paula Baniszewski, and the whole all the crimes that she had committed, and she was fired from her job and is now, we don't know where. I don't even know if she's still alive. Now, Coy, Ricky, and John, all key players, of course, in the abuse and death of Sylvia Likens, were all sentenced to 18 months in a juvenile detention center. Now, when John got out, he was, I think, 14 or 15 years old. He was the only one who really tried to get his life together. And he died from diabetic complications in 2005. Ricky, shortly after he was released from the juvenile detention center, had a complete nervous breakdown and had a really awful, rough life until he passed from cancer at a pretty young age. And then Coy Hubbard was a complete sexual sadist, psychopath, and was in and out of prison for robberies, a double murder. And I want to say that he's still in prison, I'm pretty sure. Now, when they did the autopsy of Sylvia Likens, she had over 150 wounds on her. Cuts, abrasions, scrapes, bruises. Her vaginal area was swollen completely shut. So was her throat. She'd suffered second and third degree burns. She had broken bones all over her body, and her funeral was just so sad, so sad. The whole community was grieving for her loss. And I really don't know exactly what happened to her parents. I did see pictures of her parents at her funeral just sobbing. And Jenny Likens was actually adopted by the prosecuting attorney, and sounds like she had a pretty decent life after she was adopted. And one of the things that was so hard for me to see pictures of the funeral, and what was so horribly sad to me, was the fact that all these people are mourning her death that could and should have intervened and gotten her the hell out of that house. I mean, really, the majority of the community, if not the whole community of this area in Indianapolis, knew exactly what was going on, or had heard exactly what was going on, but chose not to believe it and didn't want to get involved. And I understand that back in the 60s, that was very common. People didn't want to get involved in abusive families, and because it's like their business and we stay out of it, we mind our own business. But I don't care. Think about that. Think about how horrible that abuse was and how long it went on for, and it could have easily been stopped if somebody had intervened. Now, of course, I'm going to give you my 2 cents, as I always do in these videos. I kind of did a little bit there. But I just want to say how awful this book was to read. I mean, again, like I said at the beginning, a lot of facts. I don't know if well written is the right word, but very succinct and told the story from beginning to end. But just gruesome and so sad and so heartbreaking. And I was so angry, just livid with Gertrude and these kids, obviously mostly with Gertrude, that I would have to just put the book down and walk away for a while. I ended up in tears on a couple of occasions because my heart was just throbbing for Sylvia and for Jenny. And I know that kids are very easily influenced by adults, and they were probably terrified of her, but I couldn't help but feel angry towards the teenagers that are involved in this case too. Just unbelievable. And again, like I mentioned at the very beginning, this is not a case I'd heard much about until I watched the movie that came out a few years ago. And then I haven't heard anything about it since. And I do know, however, that this is one of the most, if not the most violent crimes that's ever happened in Indianapolis, Indiana. How could it not be? But I think part of the reason why it's not discussed, or not like commonly, discussed in videos, other true crime videos. I think I found 1 or 2 about this case, is just because it's so brutal and gruesome and horrifying. So awful. And I don't know, my biggest motivation in doing this video is because I really want people to understand what Sylvia Likens went through at the hands of Gertrude Baniszewski and those horrid children. They were children. None of them were over age 18. And again, like, I get that they were under an adult's influence, but I don't know. Anyway, I would like to know if you guys have ever heard of this case. Share your thoughts about it in the comment section. And of course, I will do my best to bring you another true crime case in the next couple of months. I know that these videos are really hard to get through, so I really appreciate your time that you take out of your lives to sit down and watch these. And until I see you again, I hope you take very good care of yourself, stay safe, and I will see you soon.